The morning was heavy with fog, blanketing the open fields like a curtain of mourning. The only sound was the quiet gurgle of wet earth shifting. Not just nature stirring, but something fighting for its life. Calder, a pale, newborn colt with a silky cream coat, thrashed weakly in the thick mud of the marshland. His small, white ears twitched as he struggled, sinking deeper. Just feet away, his mother, a striking Lipizzaner mare named Seraphine, stood at the edge, her silver mane clinging to her neck as she screamed out, helpless. Her eyes shimmered with panic, pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. But no one came, except him. Thatcher Granger stood above it all, at the edge of the rise, looking down with something cold in his eyes. He was 17, the only heir to Beauregard Granger, a man whose name was stitched into every corner of this land. Thatcher wore a pressed jacket that didn't belong on a ranch and boots far too polished for mud. He had no intention of rescuing anyone. In fact, he was the one who led Calder into the mire. No one had seen him shove the colt forward. No one but the old ranch hand hiding in the shadows. And Thatcher didn't care. Pain amused him, especially when it couldn't fight back. Seraphine lunged toward him, but he pushed her away with a grunt. "Back off, girl," he muttered, like she was nothing more than furniture in his way. Calder cried out, his legs flailing, but the mud clung tighter, swallowing him. His pale coat was now streaked with grime, his tiny mouth trembling. Seraphine let out a guttural scream, shaking the still air. In the distance, a hawk circled overhead, watching, waiting, and somewhere nearby, Ephraim Dalton, a silent man with a haunted past, watched from behind the stables, frozen in place, hands clenched, shame flickering behind his weathered eyes. Then, everything shifted. Seraphine stopped thrashing. Something inside her changed. Her eyes sharpened, not with fear, but with fire. Without warning, she stepped into the mud. Her powerful legs sank, but she pressed forward, undeterred. The earth pulled at her, but she didn't slow down. Her muscles trembled with effort, her breath ragged. But she kept moving toward Calder, toward her son. And in that still, breathless moment, the land seemed to hold its breath. Thatcher turned, confused. Ephraim blinked, heart racing. And Seraphine, she made a silent vow. She would not let her baby die, not today. Not in front of the boy who thought he could break her. Years before that morning in the marsh, Seraphine hadn't belonged to the Granger ranch at all. She had been born on a small, family-run farm nestled just beyond the ridge, where animals had names and children whispered secrets into their manes. She was gentle then, playful, obedient, soft. But that farm was swallowed whole during the drought of '09, and Seraphine was sold off to the Grangers for half her worth. Since then, she had known only fences, commands, and hard boots in the dirt. Still, there was a wildness in her that had never been broken. And now that fire had a name, Calder. Thatcher didn't see Calder as anything more than a mistake. The colt hadn't been born from a planned breeding. He was the result of a moment the stable hands never confessed to. Beauregard Granger had demanded the foal be dealt with. But Thatcher, ever the golden son, had volunteered to handle it himself. He told his father the colt had died naturally. No one questioned him. No one ever did. He was untouchable. Or at least he had always believed that. Down by the barn, Ephraim Dalton dragged his feet through the gravel, each step slower than the last. His old bones ached with the weight of secrets. He had served the Grangers since he was 17, the same age Thatcher was now. He remembered Beauregard as a young man. Cruel, entitled, always one breath away from wrath. Watching Thatcher now was like looking through time. Ephraim had once seen Beauregard strike a man for speaking too slow. Now his son tortured animals for sport. And Ephraim? He had said nothing. Again. Inside the stables, the air was thick with the scent of damp hay and fear. Calder was Seraphine's first foal, and likely her last. No other horse had ever managed to get close to her. But that colt, born during a thunderstorm in the dead of night, had changed her. She had licked the rain from his eyes before the ranch hands even noticed she'd given birth. Since then, Seraphine hadn't let him out of her sight. Not once. And now, with him sinking into the earth, that bond burned hotter than instinct. Thatcher stood at the edge of the marsh, boots mud-splashed, watching as Seraphine pushed forward. For a flicker of a moment, something uncomfortable stirred in him. Not guilt, but a strange, foreign ache. He shook it off quickly. "Let her drown too," he muttered, though his voice wasn't as firm as before. Far off, beyond the fencing, a dust trail rose. A truck approached. Behind the wheel was someone Thatcher hadn't expected. Dr. Unia Wells, the local vet, and a woman who knew far more about the Grangers than she let on. The truck rolled to a stop, dust still swirling behind its wheels. Dr. Unia Wells stepped out, her boots landing in the mud with purpose. Tall, lean, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. She had seen more cruelty hidden behind white fences than most people would in a lifetime. Her leather bag swung by her side as she looked toward the marsh and froze. Her heart skipped. Seraphine was nearly waist-deep in the muck, pushing against the pull of death. And just ahead of her, the pale head of a colt struggled to stay above the surface. "God help us," she whispered. Thatcher's eyes met hers, but only for a second. He didn't speak. Instead, he backed away from the edge, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his jaw tight. Unia narrowed her eyes at him. She'd known Thatcher since he was a boy, had stitched up his scrapes, seen him ride, seen him lie, and now something in her gut twisted. She turned back to the horses, dropping her bag and stepping closer, though she knew better than to enter the bog. "Seraphine, easy girl," she called gently. "You're not alone, not anymore." Behind her, Ephraim had emerged from the shadows, silent as smoke. His face was pale, and his lips trembled around words he couldn't form. He stopped beside Unia and lowered his hat, eyes on the scene unfolding before them. "You saw what he did?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer, not right away. Then, with a voice like gravel grinding against memory, he muttered, "Same eyes, same heart, just like Beauregard." Unia swallowed hard. That name had weight, like a storm cloud that never moved on. Down in the marsh, Seraphine reached Calder. She nudged him with her nose, soft but urgent, encouraging him to move, to fight. The colt gave a weak whinny, his ears flicking. Unia knelt by the edge, heart pounding. She couldn't reach them, not physically, but she knew horses and she knew grief. "He needs to feel you," she whispered aloud, hoping Seraphine would hear her soul if not her words. "Don't let him go."
Thatcher turned, his hands shaking slightly. He hated the sound of Unia's voice, the way it stirred something in his chest he didn't understand. He walked back toward the barn, trying to bury it. But part of him stayed behind, watching, remembering, and fearing what Seraphine might still be capable of. And in that silence, Calder moved. Just a little. But it was enough to make Seraphine step deeper into the muck. She was willing to give everything, even herself. Seraphine was no longer just a mother, she was a force of nature. With every step, the mud clung tighter, but she pushed forward, refusing to let her son die beneath the silence of this cursed land. Her body trembled, muscles screaming with effort, yet she reached Calder's side, placing her head against his. She nuzzled him, breathing life into his fading spirit. Calder blinked slowly, then let out a thin cry. Weak, but alive. Unia's chest tightened. "You've got to help her," she said aloud, more to the world than anyone in particular. But Ephraim stood frozen. Unia moved fast. She ran back to her truck, yanked a coil of rope from the bed, and tied it around a fence post. She wasn't dressed for this. Her jeans were already soaked to the knees, and the mud sucked at her boots like quicksand. But she didn't care. Tying the other end around her waist, she stepped closer to the edge. "Seraphine," she called, "I'm coming in." The mare turned her head slightly, eyes wide, as if understanding the risk, as if warning Unia to stop. But Unia had made up her mind. She had seen too many innocent things die on this land. Thatcher watched from the barn, his breath shallow. His hands gripped a wooden post so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, Seraphine's determination or Unia's defiance. He had always been the one in control. But now, control was slipping. If Unia saved them, questions would be asked. If Ephraim talked, truths would come out. And if Seraphine survived, she'd never forget. That terrified him more than anything. Unia waded into the muck, each step a battle. Her rope went taut as she reached Seraphine's flank. She gently touched the mare's side and whispered, "We'll get him out. Together." Seraphine didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted her weight, allowing Unia room to reach Calder. The colt's head lolled, his breath shallow, but his eyes found Unia's. There was trust in that look, a flicker of hope. Ephraim couldn't watch anymore. He turned away, but his conscience wouldn't let him walk. He remembered a time, decades ago, when Beauregard had done something similar, and he'd kept his mouth shut. It had haunted him every night since. This time, he couldn't be silent. "You listening, Thatcher?" he muttered into the wind. "They'll remember this. All of it." Back in the marsh, Calder let out a louder cry, the strongest yet. Seraphine shifted her stance and began pushing against him with her body, trying to lift him. Unia braced her legs, gripping Calder's neck with care. Between them, something ancient and powerful stirred, the unspoken bond between two beings who had nothing but each other. The rope around Unia's waist strained as she leaned forward, her hands digging under Calder's shoulders. The colt groaned, too tired to resist but not ready to give up. "Come on, baby," she whispered, voice cracking. "Don't you give in now." Her arms burned, her legs ached, but she kept pulling. Just behind her, Seraphine shifted again, planting her hooves as deep as they would go and pushing forward with everything she had. It was raw, primal teamwork, woman and beast, mother and stranger, united by instinct. The ground gave a sickening slurp as Calder's front legs slid free of the mud. His tiny chest heaved, ribs fluttering beneath his soaked white coat. Unia nearly collapsed under his weight but held steady. "That's it. That's it, sweet boy." Her voice was hoarse now, but her eyes burned with fire. Ephraim moved then, finally. He jogged forward, pulling the rope tighter, giving her leverage. "You got him," he shouted, his first real words all day. Unia nodded. "Almost." Inside the barn, Thatcher watched the scene unravel like a nightmare. His hands trembled. He had never meant for this to become something public, something seen. There was always supposed to be silence, control. But now there were witnesses. There was movement. And worst of all, there was compassion. He turned and kicked a bucket across the floor, the clang echoing like a gunshot. He didn't understand why it made him feel so small. Why did it hurt? As Calder was finally dragged onto firmer ground, Unia collapsed beside him, panting. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her hands covered in mud and blood. Seraphine stepped carefully beside her son, lowering her head to nuzzle his face. Calder let out a soft whinny, weak but alive. Tears welled in Unia's eyes. "You're tougher than half the men in this town," she whispered. "And Seraphine?" She simply stood guard, eyes never leaving her colt, daring the world to try again. Ephraim stood over them both now, rope in hand, face flushed. He looked down at Unia and then at the foal. "We'll need to keep him warm. Hydrated." He paused, voice cracking. "I'll get blankets." And just like that, he was in motion, for the first time in years, truly acting against the Grangers. Back near the shadows of the barn, Thatcher stood frozen. He knew what came next. Unia would start asking questions. Ephraim might finally open his mouth. And Seraphine, she would never forget what he did. The colt had survived. But the lie he built around his family's name? That was starting to sink fast, and he didn't know how to save it. Unia wrapped Calder in thick blankets from the truck, her hands moving on instinct. The colt shivered beneath the layers, his body still fighting for warmth, but his eyes were clear now. Alert. Alive. Seraphine stood over him like a statue, her coat covered in grime, but her posture proud. The bond between them pulsed in the air, something unbreakable. Unia turned to Ephraim, who returned with a metal bucket of warm water and old towels. "He's going to make it," Unia said, though her voice carried something heavier underneath. "But that's not the only thing that needs saving out here." Ephraim didn't meet her gaze. He crouched beside Calder, dipping the towels and gently wiping away the crusted mud. His hands were steady, but his shoulders sagged with the weight of long-buried guilt. "He's not the first," he said finally. Unia paused, heart skipping. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer immediately, just kept cleaning. Then, softly, "Years ago, another colt. Different mare. Same place. Beauregard said it was sick. Said to take care of it. I knew what that meant." He swallowed hard. "And I did nothing." Unia stood up, fists clenched. "That boy's not just cruel, F. He's learned it. Been fed it. And if we don't stop this now, he won't be the last Granger to do it." Her voice cracked, raw with fury. Ephraim finally looked at her. "You're right." The words felt like stones dropping from his mouth. "I've kept too many of their secrets. I thought I was just surviving. But I was helping him become this." Thatcher watched them from the shadows, every word piercing like glass under skin. He should have run back to the house, pretended none of it happened. But something pinned him there. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the echo of Unia's voice, or the way Seraphine looked at him. Not with animal fear, but with something colder. Judgment. It made his chest feel tight. For the first time, he didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed. Unia walked toward the barn slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Thatcher," she called, not yelling, just firm. His name landed like a slap. He stepped out, face pale, jaw clenched. "You're gonna have to answer for this," she said, eyes locked on his. "Not just to us. To him." She nodded toward Calder. "And to the part of you that knows what you did." Thatcher didn't respond. But in his silence, something shifted. Not regret. Not yet. But recognition that the truth was no longer buried. And like Calder, it had started to rise. The morning sun had finally broken through the fog, casting a pale, golden light across the field. Calder was resting, curled against Seraphine's side in a makeshift shelter of hay and blankets. Unia checked his breathing one last time before standing, her back aching, her clothes soaked in dried mud. She wasn't just tired, she was done. Done watching, done forgiving, done staying quiet. With her phone in hand, she walked toward the fence line where the signal was stronger. And without hesitating, she called the county animal welfare office. Ephraim watched her from a distance, heart pounding. He had spent decades telling himself there was nothing he could do. But today proved that wasn't true. He'd seen that colt sink into the earth and rise again. He'd seen Unia wade in without fear. And he'd seen the shame in Thatcher's eyes, even if the boy didn't understand it yet. "I'll talk too," he said quietly to himself. "No more protecting monsters just because they wear the family name." Inside the house, Beauregard Granger poured himself a glass of bourbon, unaware of the storm forming outside his walls. He was a man of habit, power, whiskey, silence. He hadn't asked Thatcher how things went with the colt because he expected silence in return. That was how things had always worked. But as he looked out his window and saw Unia's truck parked on his land, something inside him twitched. He'd dealt with her before. Too smart. Too stubborn. Too dangerous. Back at the barn, Thatcher paced in short, erratic lines. His mind raced, heart hammering against his ribs. He'd always lived in the space between untouchable and invisible, too protected to fall, too overlooked to question. But now, his hands still smelled like the swamp, and Unia had made a call. Maybe more than one. He kept seeing Calder's eyes, not afraid but aware. Like the colt knew what he had done. Unia hung up the phone and turned to Ephraim. They're sending someone today. Maybe 2 officers. I gave them names. I gave them everything. Ephraim nodded, jaw set, eyes steady. Good, he said. Just that one word, but it carried a lifetime of regret and a flicker of redemption. I'll be here when they come, and I'll tell them what I saw. Thatcher stood by the stable door, listening. His chest felt hollow. For the first time in his life, no one was coming to protect him. Not his father. Not the ranch hands. Not the name Granger. He looked out toward the pasture, where Seraphine stood like a queen beside her son. And for a moment, he knew, the real power never belonged to him. By noon, the sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence that had settled over the ranch. 2 county animal welfare officers stepped out of a marked truck, followed by a sheriff's deputy. Unia met them at the gate, clipboard in hand, voice calm but direct. "You'll want to speak with me, and with Ephraim Dalton," she said. "The animals are in the south barn, and the ones responsible live in the house up on the hill." There was no need to name names. The reputation of the Granger family had long preceded them, but that reputation was about to change. Beauregard watched from his porch, a glass of bourbon in hand, his jaw clenched so tight it trembled. 4 years, he'd silenced whispers with checks and threats. But now there were uniforms on his land and a woman leading them straight to the truth. "This is a mistake," he muttered, rising to his feet. "No damn vet's going to bring down my name." But deep down he knew. Unia was no ordinary woman, and this was no ordinary incident. Inside the barn, Ephraim stood by Calder's side as the officers approached. He spoke first, voice steady but low. "I saw the boy lead the colt into the marsh. Watched him leave it there. This wasn't an accident. And it wasn't the first time something like this has happened on this land." Unia stepped beside him, backing his words. Together, they gave dates, patterns, names. They spoke of fear and silence, of power unchecked. And as their words filled the air, Thatcher stood just outside, hearing every syllable fall like a stone into his chest. The deputy approached Thatcher next, notebook in hand. "Son, we need to talk." Thatcher didn't move. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. No lies rehearsed, no father to speak for him, no excuse that would change what they already knew. He looked past the officer toward Seraphine, who stood tall beside Calder, watching everything with those steady, ancient eyes. She had no voice, but somehow her presence said more than any of them. Beauregard stormed down the hill, shouting, "You don't speak to my son without a lawyer." But his voice, once commanding, now sounded brittle, cracked under the weight of truth. The officers didn't flinch. "We're not here to negotiate. We're here to protect what's left," one said, nodding toward the horses. Seraphine let out a low whinny, not in fear, but in warning. And just like that, the Granger name, once untouchable, began to fracture. Not with noise, but with quiet accountability. And from the mud where cruelty was born, justice had begun to rise. The house that once felt like a fortress now echoed with silence. Thatcher sat in his father's study, the walls lined with portraits of proud, stern-faced Grangers, generations of men who ruled land like they ruled people. Beauregard paced behind him, yelling into the phone. Lawyers, favors, denials. But none of it could drown out the sound in Thatcher's head, Calder gasping for air. Seraphine's scream. Unia's voice, calm but unshakable. The weight of everything he had done, and everything he had ignored, pressed on him like a storm he couldn't outrun. "I covered for you," Beauregard hissed, slamming the phone down. "I buried things for this family, for you, and this is how you repay me." Thatcher didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, meeting his father's eyes. "You taught me how to do it," he said, voice hollow. "You taught me how to hide, how to lie, how to feel nothing." The words hit Beauregard harder than any accusation from the outside. For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then, quietly, "You think they'll protect you now? After all this?" Outside, Unia stood beside Ephraim as officers began photographing the marsh and the barn. Seraphine and Calder had been moved to a quieter corner of the ranch, where the sun reached through the trees and the wind smelled of something cleaner. Ephraim glanced at Unia, his face lined with guilt but also with resolve. "I should have done this years ago," he said. "I could have stopped all of it. Maybe saved a few lives." Unia placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing it now. That's what matters." Later that afternoon, Unia was called to the main house. Beauregard refused to come outside. "Send the vet," he had ordered. She walked in slowly, her boots echoing against the polished floor. Thatcher stood near the fireplace, eyes downcast. Beauregard sat behind his desk, sipping his third drink of the hour. "You've made quite the mess," he said to Unia. "And yet," she replied, "it's the cleanest this place has ever felt." She turned to Thatcher. "You still have a choice. You can keep running, or you can help end this cycle." Thatcher didn't answer right away, but he stepped forward, his voice lower now. "I want to tell them everything. Not just what happened today. Everything." Beauregard scoffed. "You ungrateful," but Unia raised a hand, silencing him. "Let him speak." And for the first time, the room shifted, the old power trembled, and a new one began to take root. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Calder nuzzled against his mother's side, safe now. And in the distance, something long buried, like truth, like grief, began to surface at last. Weeks passed. The ranch, once marked by fear and silence, stood still, not abandoned, but paused. Calder had gained weight, strength, and confidence. His coat glistened again under the late afternoon sun. Seraphine stayed close, never letting him wander far, though now she moved with a quieter calm, her steps less frantic. The marsh had been fenced off by the county, declared a protected zone. No more hidden horrors. No more shallow graves. The land, like the people on it, had begun to heal. Beauregard Granger was indicted on multiple counts: animal cruelty, obstruction, historical abuse. His lawyers fought tooth and nail, but the evidence was loud, and the town had finally found its voice. For the first time in decades, people spoke openly about the things that had happened on Granger land. The veil had been lifted, and with it, the illusion of control Beauregard had so carefully crafted. Behind bars, his legacy crumbled. Thatcher testified before the county board and animal welfare officers. His confession was thorough, not as a strategy, but as surrender. There were no excuses, only truth. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect it. But as he stood beside Ephraim and Unia at the final hearing, he felt something unfamiliar, weight leaving his shoulders. "I don't know if I can make this right," he said quietly. "But I want to try." Unia didn't smile, but she nodded. That was enough. The ranch was turned over to the state temporarily, until a decision could be made. Unia stepped in as interim caretaker, with Ephraim at her side. Together, they began transforming the land into something new, a sanctuary for horses that had nowhere else to go. They named it Seraphine's Field. It wasn't grand, not yet. But it was safe. And more than that, it was honest. On the first clear morning of spring, Calder ran for the first time without limping. His legs were still awkward, still uncertain, but they carried him fast across the grass. Seraphine watched with quiet pride, her body finally at rest. Unia leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, eyes full. "You made it, little one," she whispered. Thatcher visited sometimes. He never stayed long. But he always brought something. Fresh hay, new brushes, once even a journal he'd started keeping. He never touched Calder, and Seraphine never took her eyes off him. But she didn't charge. She just watched. Judging, maybe. Forgiving, possibly. And as the wind passed through the trees and across the pasture, it carried with it something that had once been missing on Granger land. Not just justice, but peace.